I refuse to sit there. Absolutely not. Victoria Brennan's voice cut through the hum of Premier Airlines Flight 847 like a blade through silk, sharp, entitled, and loud enough for half the cabin to turn and stare. She stood in the narrow aisle of the Boeing 777-300ER, her manicured finger pointing directly at seat 18A, where a 17-year-old African-American boy sat quietly by the window, noise-canceling headphones around his neck, carefully guarding a mysterious black case in his lap. The boy didn't look up. He didn't flinch. He just kept his eyes fixed on the small window, watching ground crews load luggage below, as if he'd heard this tone before and knew exactly what was coming next. What Victoria Brennan didn't know, what none of the 347 passengers on that Tuesday night flight from JFK to London Heathrow could have possibly known, was that in exactly 8 hours, this same woman would watch in horror as the entire flight crew stood at attention and saluted the boy she was now trying to have removed. She had no idea that her pointing finger had just signed the death warrant of her own career, her reputation, and everything she'd spent 26 years building. Before we dive into this incredible true story that went viral across 6 continents and changed airline policies forever, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever been judged by your appearance, hit that subscribe button, because this Olympic champion's response will leave you speechless. Have you ever witnessed discrimination in real life? Share your story below, because what you're about to see proves that sometimes the person you dismiss today might be the one the entire world stops to salute tomorrow. Now, let's rewind to how this moment started, because the collision of prejudice and grace that happened 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean didn't begin on the plane. It started 4 hours earlier in the chaos of JFK Terminal 4, where 2 very different worlds were about to crash together. Jordan Rivera adjusted the black case in his lap for the 100th time that evening, his fingers unconsciously tracing the edges of what looked like an ordinary equipment container, but held something far more precious than anyone around him could imagine. At 17 years old, Jordan was tall and lean, with the sculpted build of a world-class athlete, though you wouldn't know it from the way he carried himself. He moved with an intentional quietness, as if trying to take up less space in a world that had always made him feel too visible. He wore a simple Team USA warm-up suit in navy blue, the kind you could buy at any sporting goods store, with only the smallest American flag embroidered near the left chest that marked it as official team gear. His noise-canceling Sony headphones hung around his neck, and his dark eyes held the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been living on adrenaline and 3 hours of sleep for the past 72 hours. The case never left his hands. Not when he'd gone through security, not when he'd grabbed a sandwich from the overpriced terminal restaurant, not even when he'd dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable gate chairs. Inside that unremarkable black pelican case, nestled in custom-cut foam and wrapped in tissue paper, was a piece of gold attached to a red, white, and blue ribbon. A piece of gold that represented 4 years of training, 6 hours a day of missing proms and parties and normal teenage experiences of his mother Elena working double shifts as a nurse in Newark just to keep him in running shoes. 3 days ago, Jordan Rivera had stood on the highest step of the Olympic podium in Paris as they played the Star-Spangled Banner and placed a gold medal around his neck for winning the 400-meter hurdles. Tonight, he just wanted to go home to his mom and his 14-year-old sister, Sophia, who'd been watching from their tiny apartment screaming at the television when he crossed the finish line. 50 feet away, Victoria Brennan was vibrating with a different kind of energy entirely. At 52, she was dressed in a severe charcoal Prada suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. A diamond tennis bracelet caught the harsh terminal lighting as she checked her platinum Cartier watch for the 7th time in 10 minutes. Victoria was the senior vice president of acquisitions for Meridian Financial, and this London trip represented either the pinnacle or the destruction of her 26-year career. The Hampton acquisition, they called it a $180 million deal that would either save her company from a hostile takeover or sign their death warrant. She was flying to London to present to the Henderson and Associates board at 10 a.m. sharp, exactly 3 hours after her scheduled landing. She'd clawed her way past 3 other VPs for this opportunity, working 20-hour days for 6 months, missing her daughter's college graduation and her father's birthday. Failure was not an option. It wasn't even a concept she allowed herself to consider. The gate area for Flight 847 was a study in barely controlled chaos. Business travelers hunched over laptops, typing furiously. Families tried to wrangle sugar-high children with iPads and snack bags. College students shared earbuds and scrolled through social media. The air smelled of stale coffee, expensive perfume, and the particular brand of anxiety that comes with international travel. At 9:47 p.m., 13 minutes past the scheduled boarding time, a voice crackled over the PA system that made Victoria's blood run cold. Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for the delay in boarding Premier Airlines Flight 847 to London Heathrow. We've experienced a last-minute aircraft equipment change due to a mechanical issue with our originally scheduled plane. We're now boarding a different Boeing 777-300ER with a slightly different cabin configuration. Victoria's fingers tightened around her boarding pass. She'd paid $4,200 out of her own pocket for that business class seat, justifying the expense as a necessary investment. She needed to arrive fresh, needed to sleep, needed to work on her presentation during the flight. The company's new austerity measures, which she had ironically proposed, had eliminated automatic business travel for VPs. The gate agent, a tired-looking man named Mark, whose smile had faded hours ago, continued the announcement that would change everything. Due to the aircraft change, our business class cabin is smaller than originally configured. We've had to move some passengers to economy, plus with full refunds and $500 travel vouchers. We'll be calling affected passengers to the counter shortly. Victoria was already moving before he finished speaking, her briefcase banging against her leg as she marched to the counter with the determination of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Excuse me." Her voice had that particular edge that service workers recognized immediately, the sound of someone who considered themselves too important to wait. "I'm Victoria Brennan, seat 3A. I trust this aircraft change won't affect my seating." Mark looked at his computer screen, and Victoria watched his expression shift from professional courtesy to barely concealed dread. "Miss Brennan, I'm so sorry. Your name is on the affected passenger list. We've had to move you to economy plus seat 18B. We'll process a full refund for the fare difference and provide a $500 voucher for future travel. Economy plus, seat 18B. A middle seat." Victoria stared at him as if he'd just informed her that her mother had died and her house had burned down in the same sentence. A middle seat in economy was not just a downgrade, it was a humiliation. It was sitting between strangers for 7 hours when she needed to work. It was arriving in London exhausted and unprepared for the most important presentation of her life. "This is unacceptable." Her voice was dangerously low, the kind of quiet that made experienced customer service representatives reach for the panic button. "I am closing a $180 million deal tomorrow morning. I need to sleep. I need to work. Find me a seat in business class. Ma'am, the cabin is completely full. There are no other seats available. Then find someone to move. Offer them money. Upgrade someone from economy to take their business seat and give me theirs." Mark's patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, all business passengers paid full fare. We can't force anyone to downgrade." Victoria's mind raced. She couldn't miss this flight. The presentation was at 10:00 a.m. London time. Taking a later flight would mean missing the meeting entirely, which would mean losing the deal, which would mean the hostile takeover would succeed, which would mean she'd lose not just her job, but her $2 million bonus and probably her reputation in the industry. She was trapped. "This is grounds for a lawsuit," she snarled, snatching the new boarding pass from Mark's hand. "I will own this airline when I'm done with you." She stormed toward the gate, her mind already formulating the complaint letter. She'd write the bad reviews, she'd post the way she'd make Premier Airlines regret the day they'd dared to inconvenience Victoria Brennan. What she didn't see as she pushed past other passengers was the quiet young man in the Team USA warm-up suit, standing patiently in the Zone 4 boarding line, carefully protecting his black case, just trying to get home to his family. Jordan Rivera had his boarding pass ready ticket 18A, a window seat, next to hers. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. As Jordan shuffled forward in the boarding line, his mind drifted back to 72 hours ago, to the moment that had changed everything. The Olympic Stadium in Paris, 80,000 people on their feet, the roar so loud he could feel it in his chest as he flew over the final hurdle and crossed the finish line in 47.36 seconds. A new personal best, a new American record, and most importantly, Olympic gold. He could still feel the weight of the medal as they'd placed it around his neck, heavier than he'd ever imagined gold could be. The French official had smiled and said something in accented English about dreams coming true, and Jordan had nodded politely while fighting back tears, thinking about his mother, Elena, working the night shift at Newark University Hospital, watching on a borrowed tablet in the break room. Elena Rivera had raised Jordan and his sister Sophia alone after their father disappeared when Jordan was 8. She'd worked double shifts, taken weekend jobs, sold her car, and walked 3 miles to work, just to keep Jordan in running shoes and pay for track club fees. When he'd started winning junior championships, she'd somehow found the money for better coaching, better equipment, travel to bigger meets. Mijo, she'd said when he'd called her from Paris after the race, her voice thick with tears and exhaustion, "Your abuela would have been so proud. She always said you had wings on your feet." Jordan's grandmother had died when he was 14, just as his times started dropping into elite territory. She'd never gotten to see him run at a major championship, but Elena kept her mother's picture on Jordan's bedroom wall right next to his collection of medals from high school state championships and junior nationals. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of drug-testing media interviews, photo sessions, and appearances that his agent had scheduled. Jordan had smiled through all of it, answered the same questions about his training and his goals, posed for pictures with politicians and celebrities who wanted to be photographed with the newest American Olympic hero. But all he'd really wanted was to go home, to sit in their tiny kitchen with Sophia and eat his mother's arroz con pollo while she told him about her first week of high school, to sleep in his own bed under the poster of Carl Lewis that had motivated him through years of early morning training sessions. The case in his lap contained more than just his gold medal. There were also the credentials that had gotten him through airport security without a second glance, official Olympic Committee documents that certified he was traveling with sanctioned equipment, TSA pre-check status that came with being on the national team. Jordan had flown dozens of times for competitions, but this was his first time flying alone with something this valuable. His coach had offered to accompany him, but Jordan had insisted he could handle it. At 17, he was legally still a minor, but he'd been traveling to track meets independently since he was 15. He knew how to keep his head down, avoid attention, and get from point A to point B without incident. What he hadn't counted on was the woman now standing at gate counter, radiating fury like heat from asphalt in summer. Victoria Brennan's path to this moment had been just as unlikely as Jordan's, though in a completely different direction. She'd grown up in working-class Detroit, the daughter of an auto plant supervisor and a school cafeteria worker. Her parents had scraped together money for her business degree at Michigan State, where she'd worked 3 part-time jobs and graduated summa cum laude with a 3.96 GPA. She'd started at Meridian Financial as a junior analyst, making $32,000 a year, sharing a studio apartment with a roommate and eating ramen noodles for dinner. But Victoria had been hungry for success in a way that bordered on obsession. She'd stayed late every night, volunteered for the projects no one else wanted, and slowly clawed her way up the corporate ladder. 26 years later, she was pulling down a seven-figure salary and commanded respect from colleagues who'd once dismissed her as that girl from Detroit. She lived in a $3 million penthouse in Manhattan, drove a Porsche, and hadn't eaten ramen noodles in 2 decades. But success had come at a cost. Victoria's marriage had ended in divorce 5 years earlier, her husband claiming she loved her career more than her family. Her relationship with her 19-year-old daughter Ashley was strained to the point where they spoke maybe once a month. She had acquaintances, not friends, and spent most weekends alone in her penthouse working. The Henderson and Associates deal represented everything she'd worked for. If she could pull it off, she'd be in line for promotion to executive vice president, maybe even chief operating officer within 2 years. The $2 million bonus wouldn't hurt either, but more than the money, it was the validation she craved. Proof that the girl from Detroit belonged in the same room as Ivy League MBAs and old money executives. The hostile takeover threat had been looming for months. Blackstone Capital had been quietly acquiring shares, and rumors suggested they already had enough to force a board vote. The Henderson deal was Meridian's lifeline, the revenue and strategic partnership that would make them too valuable to absorb. Victoria had been working on the deal for 18 months, traveling to London, quarterly building relationships, learning every detail of Henderson's operation. She knew their quarterly earnings going back 5 years, their expansion plans, their concerns about American financial regulations. She'd put together a presentation that was part business proposal, part love letter, and part work of art. But none of that would matter if she arrived exhausted and unprepared because of a middle seat in economy. As she stood at the gate counter arguing with Mark, Victoria's mind was already racing through worst-case scenarios. 7 hours in a middle seat meant no sleep, no room to work on her laptop, no privacy for the calls she needed to make to New York before the presentation. It meant arriving at Heathrow looking like she'd been traveling all night, which she would have been. In her world, appearance was everything. Perception was reality. Showing up looking anything less than perfectly polished would be like walking into the meeting with a sign around her neck that said, "I'm not important enough for business class." The irony was that Victoria had once been on the other side of this equation. As a junior analyst, she'd flown economy on business trips crammed into middle seats between strangers trying to work on presentation slides with elbows in her ribs. She'd sworn that once she made it, she'd never fly anything but business class again. And she hadn't. For the past 8 years, every flight had been business or first class. She'd grown accustomed to the space, the service, the respect that came with walking past economy passengers to reach her premium cabin. It had become part of her identity, proof of how far she'd come from that studio apartment in Detroit. Now staring at the boarding pass for seat 18B, she felt like she was sliding backward down a mountain she'd spent decades climbing. Meanwhile, other passengers were beginning to notice the commotion at the gate counter. Carlos Martinez, a 26-year-old social media influencer from Los Angeles, was already pulling out his phone to capture what looked like the beginning of a Karen moment for his Instagram story. Carlos had built a following of 400,000 people by documenting entitled behavior in public spaces, and his instincts told him this was going to be content gold. Margaret Walsh, a 67-year-old retired teacher from Boston, watched the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 40 years managing classroom dynamics. She could spot a bully from 100 yards away, and something about the blonde woman's aggressive posture and raised voice triggered every protective instinct she'd developed during her teaching career. Ryan Thompson, a 29-year-old business consultant traveling to London for a client meeting, initially felt sympathy for Victoria. He'd been bumped from business class himself on previous flights and understood the frustration. But as her voice got louder and her demands more unreasonable, his sympathy began to shift toward annoyance. Jessica Liu, a 24-year-old medical student at Columbia, was traveling to London for a clinical rotation at Guy's Hospital. She'd been studying sociology before switching to medicine, and she recognized the intersection of class privilege and entitlement playing out at the gate counter. She found herself hoping the gate agent would stand his ground. As boarding finally began at 10:15 p.m., nearly 30 minutes behind schedule, the various passenger dramas started to converge on the aircraft itself. The flight crew was already dealing with the complications of an aircraft change, passenger relocations, and a tight departure window that would require them to make up time in the air to stay on schedule. Captain Daniel Murphy had been flying for Premier Airlines for 20 years, ever since leaving the Air Force, where he'd piloted C-130 transport planes in Iraq and Afghanistan. At 51, he'd seen every kind of passenger drama imaginable, from drunken businessmen to unruly celebrities to medical emergencies at cruising altitude. He ran his cabin with military precision, but also with a deep respect for human dignity that had been shaped by his experiences in combat zones. Senior flight attendant Laura Vasquez had started her career with Premier 15 years earlier, working her way up from domestic routes to premium international flights. At 38, she had a sixth sense for passenger conflicts and had developed a reputation among her colleagues for being able to de-escalate almost any situation with a combination of firmness and compassion. Flight attendant Michael Brooks was one of the few African-American crew members on international routes, something he'd achieved through a combination of language skills, cultural sensitivity, training, and pure determination to excel in an industry that hadn't always welcomed people who looked like him. At 31, he'd experienced his share of discrimination from passengers who questioned his qualifications or authority, and he'd learned to handle it with professional grace while documenting everything for crew reports. Flight attendant Amanda Foster was the newest member of the crew, having completed her training just 6 months earlier. At 28, she was still learning to read passenger dynamics and handle conflict situations. She'd specifically requested international routes because she wanted to work with diverse passengers and practice the cultural sensitivity skills that Premier emphasized in their training. As the boarding process began, none of them had any idea that they were about to witness a confrontation that would be viewed by millions of people, change their airline's policies, and teach the world a lesson about the power of grace under pressure. The stage was set. The passengers were boarding, and Seat 18A was about to meet Seat 18B in a collision that would change both their lives forever. Zone 1, passengers and those requiring special assistance welcome aboard Premier Airlines Flight 847 to London Heathrow. We thank you for your patience during tonight's aircraft change. Laura Vasquez's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd delivered this announcement thousands of times, but tonight there was an undertone of tension. The crew was already running behind schedule, and aircraft changes always created complications that rippled through the entire boarding process. Victoria Brennan pushed toward the front of the Zone 1 line, her business class boarding pass worthless now, but her sense of entitlement fully intact. She'd made her decision during the 20-minute delay. If Premier Airlines thought they could humiliate her with a middle seat in economy, she'd make sure everyone on this plane knew exactly how unacceptable their service was. Behind her, Jordan Rivera waited patiently in the Zone 4 line, his black case secured carefully in both hands. He'd learned long ago that patience was a virtue that served him well in airports just like it did on the track. There was no point in rushing when the plane wouldn't leave without all passengers aboard. Carlos Martinez positioned perfectly to capture both the privileged woman from the gate counter and whatever drama was about to unfold had his phone ready. His Instagram followers were already commenting on his stories from the gate, asking for updates on entitled airport lady. Carlos had a good feeling this was going to be his most viral content of the week. As Victoria reached the gate agent checking boarding passes, she made one final attempt to salvage her travel experience. "I need you to understand," she said to the harried gate agent. "I'm traveling on urgent business. Is there any possibility of an upgrade opening up once everyone is seated?" The agent, who'd been dealing with displaced business class passengers for the past hour, shook his head wearily. "Ma'am, the cabin is completely full. I'm sorry, but there are no other options." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "We'll see about that." She stalked down the jet bridge, her designer heels clicking against the metal flooring like hammer strikes. Her mind was already formulating a plan. Once she was seated, she'd call the flight attendants and explain her situation. Surely someone in economy would be willing to switch seats for some compensation. People like that were always motivated by money. Jordan boarded 15 minutes later, shuffling down the narrow aisle behind a family with small children and their collection of carry-on bags, strollers, and tablets. He found row 18 easily enough, 3 seats in the middle section of the 707's economy cabin. 18A was a window seat, which was exactly what he'd wanted. He could lean against the wall and try to sleep, and the window would give him something to look at besides other passengers. He settled into the seat carefully, making sure his black case fit securely in the space between his feet and the seat in front of him. The case was slightly larger than standard carry-on dimensions, but his Olympic Committee credentials had gotten it approved as essential equipment. He'd learned to wedge it carefully in place so it wouldn't shift during turbulence or taxi. The middle seat next to him was empty for now, and Jordan found himself hoping it would stay that way. After 3 days of constant interaction with media officials and fellow athletes, he was craving some quiet time to decompress. He put his headphones on and closed his eyes, letting the ambient noise of boarding passengers wash over him. That's when the shadow fell across his row. "Excuse me." Jordan opened his eyes to see a woman standing in the aisle, holding a boarding pass and looking at him with an expression he'd seen before. It was the look people got when they were trying to decide whether he belonged somewhere or not. The look that sized him up based on his age, his skin color, and his casual clothes before bothering to get to know anything about him. "Yes, ma'am," Jordan said politely, pulling off his headphones. Victoria Brennan looked at the seat assignment on her boarding pass, then at Jordan, then back at the boarding pass. Seat 18B. The middle seat, right next to this teenager. "You're in my row," she stated, as if this were somehow his fault. Jordan checked his own boarding pass. "Yes, ma'am. I'm 18A. He pointed to his window seat. "You must be 18B. "And I," Victoria said, her voice already carrying an edge of displeasure, "am supposed to sit there for 7 hours. She gestured to the middle seat with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something particularly unpleasant stuck to the bottom of one's shoe. Jordan, polite by nature and taught by his mother to always show respect to adults, unbuckled his seatbelt and started to stand. "Would you like me to step out so you can get settled?" But Victoria didn't move to take her seat. Instead, she stood there looking at Jordan, then at the passenger in 18C, a college-aged kid who was already plugged into a movie, and then back at Jordan. Her nose wrinkled slightly as if she detected an unpleasant odor. "No," she said loud enough for the passengers around them to hear. "Absolutely not." Jordan blinked, confused. "Ma'am, I am not sitting here." Victoria's voice was no longer trying to be polite or discreet. It carried clearly through the cabin, causing other passengers to look up from their phones and conversations. "This is completely unacceptable." She turned and planted herself in the aisle, blocking the line of passengers still trying to board. Behind her, a man with a heavy carry-on bag sighed audibly. "Ma'am," he said, "can you please move? I need to get to my seat." "I will not," Victoria snapped, whirling around to face him. "I paid for a business class ticket, and I am being forced into this cattle car next to—" She gestured toward Jordan without quite pointing directly at him, but her meaning was clear enough that several passengers turned to stare. Jordan felt his stomach clench with familiar dread. He'd been in this situation before at restaurants where hostesses insisted there were no tables available despite empty seats at hotels where desk clerks suddenly couldn't find his confirmed reservation at track meets where officials scrutinized his paperwork more carefully than they did his competitors. The look in Victoria's eyes was one he recognized, and it never led anywhere good. "Ma'am, what's the problem?" Jordan asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Victoria laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that carried no humor whatsoever. "The problem. The problem is that I don't feel safe. The problem is I don't know what you're listening to in those headphones or what you've got in that box." She pointed at his black case with obvious suspicion. "I am a businesswoman. I have important work and I will not be crowded and intimidated for 7 hours. The college kid in seat 18C finally looked up from his movie, pulling out one earbud. Lady, he's not doing anything. He was sitting quietly before you got here. Don't tell me what I can and cannot be concerned about, Victoria shot back. I have a right to feel secure on this flight. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher sitting 2 rows back, had been watching the exchange with growing concern. At 67, she'd seen enough playground bullying to recognize it in adult form, and everything about this woman's behavior triggered her protective instincts. Young man Margaret called out to Jordan, "You are doing absolutely nothing wrong. Don't let anyone tell you different." Victoria whirled around to face this new challenger. "Excuse me, you don't know anything about this situation." "I know a bully when I see one," Margaret replied evenly. "And I know that boy has been nothing but polite since he sat down." Carlos Martinez, who had managed to get a seat just 3 rows forward with a perfect view of the drama unfolding, was already live-streaming the confrontation to his Instagram followers. His phone screen showed the view count climbing rapidly as viewers tuned in to watch what was clearly shaping up to be a viral moment. "Y'all seeing this?" he whispered into his phone. "This woman is having a full meltdown because she has to sit next to a black kid. This is discrimination happening in real time." Ryan Thompson, the business consultant, had initially felt some sympathy for Victoria's frustration about being downgraded from business class. But her behavior toward Jordan was crossing lines that made him deeply uncomfortable. He found himself reaching for his own phone to document what was happening. "Ma'am," he called out, "the young man hasn't done anything wrong. Maybe we should all just try to get settled so we can take off." "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," Victoria snapped. "None of you understand what's happening here. I was supposed to be in business class. I have a critical presentation tomorrow morning. I cannot arrive in London exhausted because I was forced to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong in this section." The phrase "doesn't belong" hung in the air like smoke from a fire, and suddenly the entire surrounding area of the cabin went quiet. Conversation stopped. Phones came out. The nature of the confrontation shifted from travel frustration to something much more serious. Jessica Liu, the medical student, felt her training kick in. In her sociology courses, she'd studied the language of discrimination, the coded phrases people use to express prejudice, without explicitly acknowledging it. Victoria's words were textbook examples. "Ma'am," Jessica said firmly, "what exactly do you mean by 'doesn't belong'? This is economy class. He has a ticket just like everyone else." Victoria's face reddened. "I mean, he's suspicious. Look at him. Look at that case he won't let go of. This is exactly the kind of situation you see on the news." Amanda Foster, the newest flight attendant, appeared at Jordan's row, drawn by the commotion and the growing crowd of passengers standing in the aisles. At 28 and fresh out of training, she wasn't sure how to handle a situation that seemed to be escalating beyond normal passenger disputes. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, trying to project authority she didn't quite feel. "No, everything is not okay," Victoria said immediately. "I'm being forced to sit next to someone who is making me uncomfortable, and when I try to address my concerns, I'm being attacked by other passengers." Amanda looked at Jordan, who was still sitting quietly in his window seat, his hands resting calmly on his black case. "Sir, is there a problem?" "No, ma'am," Jordan replied. "I'm just trying to get home to see my mom." The simple honesty of his response, delivered in a soft voice that carried none of the anger or frustration that Victoria was projecting, made Amanda's decision easy. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't being caused by the teenager. Ma'am, Amanda said to Victoria, "I need you to take your seat so we can continue boarding and depart on time." "I want to speak to your supervisor," Victoria demanded. "I want to speak to the captain. This is a safety issue." Laura Vasquez, who had been monitoring the situation from the galley, decided it was time to intervene before the confrontation delayed their departure further. She approached row 18 with the confident stride of someone who'd handled countless passenger disputes. "Good evening, folks. I'm Laura, the senior flight attendant. What seems to be the issue here?" Victoria launched into her complaints again, but this time her language was more carefully chosen. She talked about feeling uncomfortable about security concerns, about the importance of her business travel. She avoided directly stating what everyone could see she was really objecting to. Laura listened patiently, then looked at Jordan. "Sir, I don't see any problems with your seating or your carry-on items. Your case appears to be properly stowed and you haven't caused any disruption." "That's because you don't know what's in it," Victoria interjected. "He could have anything in there. Why won't he tell us what it is?" Jordan looked up at Laura, his dark eyes holding a weariness that seemed too old for his 17 years. "Ma'am, it's just some equipment from work. Nothing dangerous." "See," Victoria said triumphantly. "He won't even tell us what kind of work a teenager does that requires special equipment." Carlos Martinez was practically vibrating with excitement as his live stream viewer count topped 30,000 people. The comments section was exploding, but he could see the general sentiment was overwhelmingly against the woman causing the scene. "This is unbelievable," he whispered to his followers. "This woman is really trying to get this kid removed from the plane just for existing while black." Laura Vasquez had reached the limit of her patience with Victoria's disruption. In her 15 years of flying, she'd developed a sixth sense for passengers who were going to be problems, and Victoria Brennan was setting off every alarm bell she had. "Ma'am, I need you to take your assigned seat immediately, or we'll need to discuss removing you from the aircraft for disrupting the boarding process." The threat of removal got Victoria's attention, but not in the way Laura had hoped. Instead of backing down, Victoria doubled down on her position. "You're threatening to remove me for expressing legitimate safety concerns. This is exactly the kind of discrimination against paying customers that will be featured in my complaint to your airline's corporate office." She pulled out her phone and began recording Laura. "I want this documented. I want everyone to see how Premier Airlines treats business class passengers who are forced into cattle car conditions against their will." The confrontation had now attracted the attention of passengers throughout the middle section of the plane. Some were openly recording the scene. Others were commenting to their seatmates about the obvious discrimination they were witnessing. A few were posting to social media in real time. What none of them knew, what Victoria Brennan couldn't have possibly imagined, was that the quiet teenager she was trying to have removed was about to change all their lives. The black case she was so suspicious of contained not a weapon or contraband, but a piece of Olympic gold that would soon make her the most hated woman on the internet. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered long after Flight 847 landed at Heathrow. And Jordan Rivera, the boy who just wanted to go home to his mother, was about to teach an entire plane full of adults what dignity really looked like. The boarding process had completely stalled. Passengers were backed up down the jet bridge, craning their necks to see what was causing the delay, while Victoria Brennan stood her ground in the aisle like a general defending territory she had no right to claim. "I have a right to know what's sitting next to me for 7 hours," Victoria declared, her voice carrying a new edge of self-righteousness. She'd found her angle now, the talking point that would justify her behavior to anyone who questioned it. This wasn't about race, she could claim. This was about security. Jordan Rivera looked up at her from his window seat, his hands still resting protectively on the black case in his lap. At 17, he'd already learned that there were moments in life when every word mattered, when a single wrong response could escalate a situation beyond repair. This felt like one of those moments. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "it's just equipment from work." "Work?" Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "What kind of work does a teenager do that requires carrying around mystery equipment in a locked case?" Carlos Martinez, live streaming from 3 rows up, whispered excitedly into his phone as his viewer count climbed past 50,000. "She's really doing this, y'all. She's interrogating this kid about his personal belongings like she's airport security. If you believe in standing up against discrimination, hit that like button right now," Carlos added to his live stream. "This is exactly why we need to document these moments." Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher who'd been watching the confrontation with growing disgust, finally reached her breaking point. At 67 years old, she'd spent 40 years protecting kids from bullies, and she wasn't about to stop now. "That boy hasn't done anything but mind his own business," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "You're the only one causing a problem here." Victoria whirled around to face this new challenger, her perfectly styled hair beginning to show signs of stress. "Excuse me, do you know what it's like to pay for business class and be forced to sit in economy next to someone who won't even explain what they're carrying? I know what it's like to see an adult bully a child," Margaret shot back. "And that's exactly what you're doing." Ryan Thompson, who had been wrestling with his conscience for the past 10 minutes, found himself speaking up despite his natural inclination to avoid confrontation. "Ma'am, with respect, the young man has been completely polite. You're the one causing the disruption. Don't you lecture me about disruption," Victoria snapped. "I'm trying to address legitimate safety concerns, and all of you are more interested in political correctness than passenger security." Jessica Liu, the medical student, felt her training in both sociology and patient advocacy kick in. She recognized Victoria's language patterns the way she'd learned to recognize symptoms of disease. This was textbook discrimination dressed up in the language of reasonable concern. "What specific safety concerns?" Jessica asked calmly. "He's sitting quietly with his seatbelt fastened and his carry-on properly stowed. What exactly is threatening about that?" Victoria's face flushed deeper red. "The case. He won't tell us what's in it. In today's security environment, don't you think passengers have a right to know what's being brought onto their flight?" Jordan looked up at Victoria with the kind of tired patience that comes from having this conversation too many times. "Ma'am, TSA screened everything at security. I went through the same checkpoints you did." "TSA misses things all the time," Victoria countered. "And you still haven't told us what's in there." The college student in seat 18C, who had been trying to ignore the confrontation and watch his movie, finally pulled out both earbuds and turned to face Victoria directly. "Lady, what's wrong with you? The guy passed through security. He's been sitting here quietly. You're the only one causing drama." "Don't call me lady," Victoria hissed. "I'm trying to ensure passenger safety, and all of you are enabling someone who clearly has something to hide." Amanda Foster, the newest flight attendant, was beginning to panic. In her 6 months on the job, she'd dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and even one attempted mile-high club incident, but nothing had prepared her for a passenger who seemed determined to create a confrontation based on what appeared to be racial prejudice. "Ma'am," Amanda tried again. "I really need you to take your seat so we can depart on time. Other passengers are waiting." "Other passengers should be thanking me for asking the questions they're too afraid to ask," Victoria replied. "Look around. How many of you are comfortable sitting near someone who won't explain what they're carrying in an unmarked case?" She gestured to the surrounding passengers, clearly expecting support. Instead, she was met with stares that ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Carlos Martinez was practically bouncing in his seat as he captured every moment for his rapidly growing online audience. "Did y'all hear that he whispered to his phone? She's really trying to turn this into some kind of security theater to justify her racism. This is wild. Share this with someone who needs to see what discrimination looks like in 2024, Carlos added to his followers. "This is exactly why we can't stay silent." Laura Vasquez appeared again, having been called forward by Amanda. As the senior flight attendant, Laura had seen every permutation of passenger conflict possible, but Victoria's behavior was pushing boundaries she rarely encountered. "Ma'am," Laura said firmly, "I'm going to ask you one more time to take your assigned seat. If you continue to disrupt boarding, we'll have to consider removing you from the aircraft." Victoria's eyes blazed with indignation. "You're threatening to remove me for asking reasonable questions. This boy could be carrying anything in that case, weapons, drugs, who knows what, and when I try to address my concerns, you threaten me." "The passenger has cleared security screening," Laura replied evenly. "TSA has approved all carry-on items. There are no safety concerns with his seating or belongings." "Then why won't he just tell us what's in the case?" Victoria demanded. "If it's so innocent, why all the secrecy?" Jordan looked around at the crowd of passengers that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Some were filming with their phones. Others were shaking their heads in disgust. A few looked uncomfortable, unsure of what to believe. He thought about his mother Elena working the night shift at Newark University Hospital, checking her phone between patients to see if his flight had taken off safely. He thought about his sister Sophia probably staying up past her bedtime to text with friends about her famous brother. He thought about the past 3 days of interviews where reporters had asked him about being a role model for young people. "It's a medal," he said quietly. Victoria blinked, caught off guard by his sudden response. "What? You asked what's in the case." "It's a medal. From work." "A medal?" Victoria's voice carried a note of skepticism. "What kind of medal requires a security case?" Before Jordan could answer, Margaret Walsh spoke up from her seat. "Son, you don't owe her any explanation. You don't have to justify your belongings to anyone except security." But Jordan was tired. Tired of the confrontation. Tired of being treated like a threat. Tired of being judged based on his appearance. He was 17 years old, and all he wanted was to go home. "It's a gold medal," he said simply. "From Paris." The boarding process had completely stalled. Passengers were backed up down the jet bridge, craning their necks to see what was causing the delay, while Victoria Brennan stood her ground in the aisle like a general defending territory she had no right to claim. "I have a right to know what's sitting next to me for 7 hours. Victoria declared, her voice carrying a new edge of self-righteousness. She'd found her angle, now the talking point that would justify her behavior to anyone who questioned it. This wasn't about race, she could claim. This was about security. Jordan Rivera looked up at her from his window seat, his hands still resting protectively on the black case in his lap. At 17, he'd already learned that there were moments in life when every word mattered, when a single wrong response could escalate a situation beyond repair. This felt like one of those moments. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "it's just equipment from work." Work? Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. What kind of work does a teenager do that requires carrying around mystery equipment in a locked case? Carlos Martinez, live streaming from 3 rows up, whispered excitedly into his phone as his viewer count climbed past 50,000. "She's really doing this, y'all. She's interrogating this kid about his personal belongings like she's airport security. If you believe in standing up against discrimination, hit that like button right now," Carlos added to his live stream. "This is exactly why we need to document these moments." Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher who'd been watching the confrontation with growing disgust, finally reached her breaking point. At 67 years old, she'd spent 40 years protecting kids from bullies, and she wasn't about to stop now. "That boy hasn't done anything but mind his own business," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "You're the only one causing a problem here." Victoria whirled around to face this new challenger, her perfectly styled hair beginning to show signs of stress. "Excuse me. Do you know what it's like to pay for business class and be forced to sit in economy next to someone who won't even explain what they're carrying? I know what it's like to see an adult bully a child," Margaret shot back. "And that's exactly what you're doing." Ryan Thompson, who had been wrestling with his conscience for the past 10 minutes, found himself speaking up despite his natural inclination to avoid confrontation. "Ma'am, with respect, the young man has been completely polite. You're the one causing the disruption." "Don't you lecture me about disruption," Victoria snapped. I'm trying to address legitimate safety concerns, and all of you are more interested in political correctness than passenger security. Jessica Liu. The medical student felt her training in both sociology and patient advocacy kick in. She recognized Victoria's language patterns the way she'd learned to recognize symptoms of disease. This was textbook discrimination dressed up in the language of reasonable concern. What specific safety concerns? Jessica asked calmly. He's sitting quietly with his seatbelt fastened and his carry-on properly stowed. What exactly is threatening about that? Victoria's face flushed deeper red. The case. He won't tell us what's in it. In today's security environment, don't you think passengers have a right to know what's being brought onto their flight? Jordan looked up at Victoria with the kind of tired patience that comes from having this conversation too many times. Ma'am, TSA screened everything at security. I went through the same checkpoints you did. TSA misses things all the time, Victoria countered. And you still haven't told us what's in there. The college student in seat 18C, who had been trying to ignore the confrontation and watch his movie, finally pulled out both earbuds and turned to face Victoria directly. Lady, what's wrong with you? The guy passed through security. He's been sitting here quietly. You're the only one causing drama. Don't call me lady, Victoria hissed. I'm trying to ensure passenger safety, and all of you are enabling someone who clearly has something to hide. Amanda Foster, the newest flight attendant, was beginning to panic. In her 6 months on the job, she'd dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and even one attempted mile-high club incident, but nothing had prepared her for a passenger who seemed determined to create a confrontation based on what appeared to be racial prejudice. Ma'am, Amanda tried again. I really need you to take your seat so we can depart on time. Other passengers are waiting. Other passengers should be thanking me for asking the questions they're too afraid to ask. Victoria replied. Look around. How many of you are comfortable sitting near someone who won't explain what they're carrying in an unmarked case? She gestured to the surrounding passengers, clearly expecting support. Instead, she was met with stares that ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Carlos Martinez was practically bouncing in his seat as he captured every moment for his rapidly growing online audience. Did y'all hear that he whispered to his phone? She's really trying to turn this into some kind of security theater to justify her racism. This is wild. Share this with someone who needs to see what discrimination looks like in 2024, Carlos added to his followers. This is exactly why we can't stay silent. Laura Vasquez appeared again, having been called forward by Amanda. As the senior flight attendant, Laura had seen every permutation of passenger conflict possible, but Victoria's behavior was pushing boundaries she rarely encountered. Ma'am, Laura said firmly, I'm going to ask you one more time to take your assigned seat. If you continue to disrupt boarding, we'll have to consider removing you from the aircraft. Victoria's eyes blazed with indignation. You're threatening to remove me for asking reasonable questions. This boy could be carrying anything in that case. Weapons, drugs, who knows what. And when I try to address my concerns, you threaten me. The passenger has cleared security screening, Laura replied evenly. TSA has approved all carry-on items. There are no safety concerns with his seating or belongings. Then why won't he just tell us what's in the case? Victoria demanded. If it's so innocent, why all the secrecy? Jordan looked around at the crowd of passengers that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Some were filming with their phones. Others were shaking their heads in disgust. A few looked uncomfortable, unsure of what to believe. He thought about his mother Elena working the night shift at Newark University Hospital, checking her phone between patients to see if his flight had taken off safely. He thought about his sister Sophia probably staying up past her bedtime to text with friends about her famous brother. He thought about the past 3 days of interviews where reporters had asked him about being a role model for young people. It's a medal, he said quietly. Victoria blinked, caught off guard by his sudden response. What? You asked, what's in the case? It's a medal. From work. A medal? Victoria's voice carried a note of skepticism. What kind of medal requires a security case? Before Jordan could answer, Margaret Walsh spoke up from her seat. Son, you don't owe her any explanation. You don't have to justify your belongings to anyone except security. But Jordan was tired. Tired of the confrontation, tired of being treated like a threat, tired of being judged based on his appearance. He was 17 years old, and all he wanted was to go home. It's a gold medal, he said simply. From Paris. The words hung in the air for a moment before Victoria's brain processed them. A gold medal from Paris. The Olympics had ended just 3 days ago. The math was starting to add up, but Victoria's mind rejected the possibility before it could fully form. Paris, she said with obvious skepticism. You're claiming to be an Olympic athlete. Carlos Martinez almost dropped his phone. He'd been live streaming the confrontation for content, but now he was starting to put pieces together. The timing, the security case, the way the kid carried himself with quiet confidence despite being harassed. Oh my God, he whispered to his followers. Y'all, I think this kid might actually be telling the truth. The Olympics just ended. The team would be flying home now. But Victoria was just getting started. The idea that this teenager in a basic tracksuit could be an Olympic champion was so preposterous to her that she doubled down on her skepticism. Anyone can claim to be an Olympic athlete, she announced loudly. Anyone can buy a fake medal online. This is exactly the kind of story someone would make up to avoid scrutiny. She turned to Amanda Foster. I want security called. I want this person's identification verified. I want proof that this medal is legitimate before I'm forced to sit next to someone carrying unknown items in a locked case. Amanda's training had covered difficult passengers, but not passengers demanding security verification of Olympic medals. She looked to Laura Vasquez for guidance, but Laura was already moving toward the phone to call the cockpit. Michael Brooks, the flight attendant who had been monitoring the situation from the forward galley, decided it was time to get involved. As one of the few African-American crew members on international routes, he'd experienced his share of passenger discrimination and had developed strategies for handling it professionally while protecting his dignity and that of other passengers. Sir, he said, approaching Jordan's row, I apologize for the disruption. May I ask your name? Jordan Rivera, Jordan replied. Michael pulled out his tablet and quickly accessed the passenger manifest. Jordan Rivera, seat 18A, traveling alone with special documentation for equipment transport. The notation in his file indicated Olympic Committee credentials and TSA pre-check status. Mr. Rivera Michael said formally, I see you have special documentation noted in your file. Would you mind if I verified your credentials to help resolve this situation? Jordan nodded and reached into his backpack, pulling out a leather credential holder. Inside were his Olympic Committee identification, his USA track and field card, and a letter from the Olympic Committee authorizing transport of competition-related equipment. Michael examined the documents carefully. They looked completely legitimate. The Olympic Committee letterhead. The official seals the photographs that clearly matched the young man sitting in 18A. He'd seen similar documentation before from other elite athletes traveling with equipment. Thank you, Mr. Rivera, Michael said. These appear to be in order. But Victoria wasn't satisfied. Those could be fake too. Anyone with a decent printer could make official-looking documents. I want actual verification, not just someone looking at papers that could have been made in someone's garage. Margaret Walsh had heard enough. At 67, she'd taught middle school for 40 years, and she recognized a bully who wouldn't back down no matter how much evidence contradicted their position. You are making an absolute fool of yourself, she told Victoria bluntly. That boy has been polite and respectful while you've acted like a spoiled child. Even if he weren't an athlete, your behavior would be inexcusable. Victoria rounded on her. Don't you dare lecture me about my behavior. I'm trying to ensure passenger safety while all of you are more concerned with appearing politically correct than addressing legitimate concerns. Legitimate concerns. Jessica Liu, the medical student, couldn't stay quiet any longer. You've decided this young man is a threat based on absolutely nothing. He passed security. He has proper documentation, and he's been completely cooperative. Your concerns aren't legitimate. They're discriminatory. Victoria's face went red with fury. How dare you accuse me of discrimination? I have legitimate business reasons for my concerns. I'm flying to London to close a $180 million deal. I cannot afford to take risks with my safety. Then maybe you should have paid attention during the safety briefing instead of harassing passengers, called out a voice from several rows back. Carlos Martinez was practically vibrating with excitement as his live stream viewer count topped 75,000. The comments section was exploding with people trying to figure out if the kid was really an Olympic athlete and expressing outrage at the woman's behavior. "This is insane, y'all," he whispered to his phone. "This woman is really trying to interrogate an Olympic champion because she doesn't want to sit next to a black kid. This is about to go viral in the worst way for her." Laura Vasquez returned from the cockpit with Captain Murphy behind her. At 51, Captain Murphy had the bearing of a military officer and the no-nonsense attitude that came with 20 years of flying commercial aircraft. He'd been briefed on the situation by Laura and was not pleased with the delay it was causing. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. Victoria immediately launched into her complaints again, but this time she focused on the business class downgrade and her concerns about security screening procedures rather than directly attacking Jordan. She'd learned to moderate her language when speaking to authority figures, but the underlying message remained the same. Captain Murphy listened patiently, then looked at Jordan. "Son, are you the passenger with Olympic Committee documentation?" "Yes, sir," Jordan replied. "May I see your credentials?" Jordan handed over his credential holder again. Captain Murphy examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd reviewed thousands of official papers during his military career. Everything appeared to be legitimate and properly authorized. "These look to be in order," he said. "Is there anything else you need, ma'am?" Victoria realized she was losing the support of authority figures and made one last desperate play. "I want him to open the case. If there's really just a medal inside, why not show it? What's he hiding?" The request sent a ripple of discomfort through the surrounding passengers. Even those who had been unsure about the situation recognized that demanding a passenger open their personal belongings went far beyond reasonable requests. "Ma'am," Captain Murphy said firmly, "passengers are not required to display their personal property for other passengers. The gentleman's items have been properly screened and documented. I need you to take your seat immediately so we can depart. And if I refuse, then you'll be deplaning and your luggage will be removed from the cargo hold." The threat was clear, and Victoria finally understood that she'd pushed as far as she could push. But instead of backing down gracefully, she decided to make one final statement that would seal her fate. "Fine," she said loudly. "But when something happens on this flight because you all were too politically correct to ask the hard questions, remember that I tried to warn you." She finally sat down in seat 18B, but her body language radiated hostility and resentment. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, composing what she clearly intended to be a scathing complaint about the airline's security procedures and customer service. What she didn't realize was that Carlos Martinez was still live streaming, and her final comments had been heard by nearly 100,000 viewers who were now sharing clips across every social media platform imaginable. The hashtag #FlightShame was beginning to trend, and Victoria Brennan was about to become the most infamous airline passenger in the world. But the real revelation was still coming. And when it arrived, it would transform Jordan Rivera from a harassed teenager into a symbol of grace under pressure, while simultaneously destroying everything Victoria had worked 26 years to build. 20 minutes after takeoff, as the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign flickered off Victoria, Brennan made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up in the aisle, and decided to take her case to the court of public opinion. "Excuse me, everyone," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the economy cabin. Can I have your attention, please? Passengers looked up from their books, tablets, and conversations, startled by the unusual announcement. Flight attendants began moving toward her from both directions, sensing that whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be good for anyone involved. I want everyone on this flight to know what happened during boarding. Victoria continued, her voice getting louder and more strident. I was forced to sit next to someone carrying a suspicious item, and when I raised legitimate safety concerns, I was threatened and intimidated by the crew. Carlos Martinez, who had stopped live streaming during takeoff but resumed once they reached cruising altitude, frantically tried to get his phone positioned to capture what was clearly going to be an epic meltdown. His viewer count was climbing rapidly as word spread across social media about the confrontation. Ma'am Laura Vasquez called out as she approached. "I need you to take your seat." "I will not," Victoria replied defiantly. "Does anyone else feel unsafe? This is exactly what you see on the news, people carrying mysterious items refusing to explain what they are, and anyone who asks questions gets accused of discrimination." She gestured toward Jordan, who was sitting quietly in his window seat, his headphones back on, but his eyes alert. He'd hoped the confrontation was over, but clearly Victoria had other plans. "Look at him," she continued. "Does he look like someone who should be carrying expensive equipment? Does his story make sense to anyone with common sense?" Margaret Walsh was out of her seat before the words had fully left Victoria's mouth. At 67, she might have been retired, but her teacher instincts were as sharp as ever, and she would not tolerate a bully attacking a child in her presence. "Sit down and shut up," Margaret said with the authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades managing classroom behavior. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself, and you're disturbing everyone on this plane." "Don't you dare tell me to shut up," Victoria shot back. "I'm trying to address a safety concern that affects all of us. When something happens because everyone was too afraid to ask hard questions, remember this moment." Jessica Liu, the medical student, stood up from her seat several rows back. "Ma'am, what exactly do you think is going to happen? He's been sitting quietly for an hour. The only threat to passenger safety is your disruptive behavior." "You people don't understand," Victoria said, her voice taking on a note of desperation. "I've worked my entire career to get where I am. I know how to assess risk. I know when something doesn't add up." Ryan Thompson, who had been watching the entire confrontation with growing discomfort, finally reached his breaking point. "Ma'am, what doesn't add up is your behavior. You've been harassing this young man since boarding, and now you're trying to turn other passengers against him. It's wrong, and you need to stop." Victoria whirled to face him. "Oh, really? And what do you know about it? Have you looked at his documentation? Have you verified his story? Or are you just going along with the crowd because it's easier than asking hard questions?" "I've looked at his behavior," Ryan replied firmly. "And the only person causing problems on this flight is you." By now, nearly every passenger in the middle section of the plane was paying attention to the confrontation. Some were openly recording with their phones. Others were whispering to their seatmates about the obvious discrimination they were witnessing. A few looked uncomfortable, caught between their dislike of Victoria's behavior and their uncertainty about the situation. Carlos Martinez was in live stream heaven. His viewer count had topped 150,000, and the comments were flowing too fast for him to read. But the overall sentiment was crystal clear. Viewers were outraged by Victoria's behavior and increasingly supportive of Jordan. "This is unreal," he whispered to his followers. "This woman is really trying to incite other passengers against this kid. She's having a full racist meltdown at 37,000 feet. Amanda Foster and Michael Brooks converged on Victoria's position from opposite sides, trying to contain the situation before it escalated further. But Victoria was beyond reason, now driven by a combination of stress, entitlement, and the dawning realization that she was losing control of the narrative. "Fine," she announced to the cabin. "Since none of you want to ask the obvious questions, I'll ask them." "Young man," she called out to Jordan, "what's your full name?" Jordan looked up from his window seat. his dark eyes steady despite the obvious discomfort of being singled out. "Jordan Rivera, ma'am. And how old are you?" 17. 17? Victoria repeated for the benefit of the other passengers. A 17-year-old claiming to be an Olympic athlete. Does that sound plausible to anyone Margaret Walsh had heard enough? Yes, it sounds plausible because Olympic athletes can be any age. Some swimmers have competed at 14. Gymnasts are often teenagers. Your ignorance about sports doesn't make his story suspicious. Ignorance. Victoria's voice pitched higher. I know enough to recognize when something doesn't make sense. A teenager from who knows where carrying expensive equipment with convenient documentation that could be faked by anyone with access to a computer. The cabin was getting restless now. Passengers were beginning to complain audibly about the disruption. A baby started crying in the back. A businessman called out for the flight attendants to handle the situation. The atmosphere was becoming toxic. But Jordan Rivera, the target of all this hostility, remained calm. He pulled off his headphones completely and looked directly at Victoria with the kind of steady gaze that only comes from absolute confidence in one's own truth. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin despite its soft tone. "I understand you're upset about your seating situation. I'm sorry you didn't get the seat you paid for. That's not fair to you. But I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal because you're having a bad day." The simple dignity of his response, delivered without anger or defensiveness, sent a ripple through the cabin. Several passengers nodded approvingly. Others looked ashamed of the way they'd allowed the situation to continue. But Victoria was too far gone to recognize the grace she was being offered. Instead, she doubled down on her attacks. "Don't you lecture me about having a bad day," she snarled. "I'm trying to protect everyone on this flight from a potential security threat, and you're worried about my attitude," Ma'am Jordan replied, still calm. "I'm not a security threat. I'm just a kid trying to get home to see my mom." The honesty and simplicity of his words hit the cabin like a physical force. Here was a teenager being publicly humiliated and accused of being a terrorist, and his response was to talk about wanting to see his mother. The contrast between his grace and Victoria's vitriol was becoming impossible for anyone to ignore. Captain Murphy's voice came over the intercom, clearly having reached the end of his patience with the disruption. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have a passenger who is refusing to remain seated and is disturbing other travelers. Flight attendants are addressing the situation now. Please remain in your seats while we handle this matter." The announcement was a clear warning to Victoria, but she was past the point of heeding warnings. She'd staked her reputation on being right about this situation, and backing down now would mean admitting she'd been wrong about everything. What she didn't know was that her public humiliation of Jordan Rivera was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, Victoria Brennan would become the most hated woman on the internet. The stage was set for the revelation that would change everything. Laura Vasquez had reached the limits of her professional patience with Victoria Brennan, but something about Jordan Rivera's documentation had been nagging at her since she'd first seen it. Olympic Committee credentials weren't unusual on international flights. Elite athletes flew commercially all the time. But the timing of this flight, just 3 days after the Paris Olympics had ended, was making her wonder if there was more to this situation than she'd initially realized. During a brief lull in Victoria's tirade while she was frantically typing on her phone and muttering about lawsuits and corporate complaints, Laura discreetly approached Michael Brooks near the galley. "Michael, that young man's documentation," she whispered. "The Olympic Committee credentials. The timing is right for athletes returning from Paris." Michael nodded. "I was thinking the same thing. The security tags on his case, the special documentation. It all checks out as legitimate." "What if he's not just any athlete?" Laura asked. "What if he's someone significant?" The two flight attendants exchanged glances. They'd both worked international routes long enough to have transported celebrities, politicians, and world-class athletes. Sometimes the biggest names traveled with the least fanfare specifically to avoid the kind of attention that was now being forced on Jordan. "Should we check the passenger manifest against the Olympic team roster?" Michael asked. Laura was already pulling out her tablet. Premier Airlines had access to various databases for security and customer service purposes, and with the Olympics having just ended, information about American team members was readily available through their sports partnership programs. She quickly accessed the USA Track and Field website and searched for Jordan Rivera. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. Jordan Rivera, 17 Los Angeles, 400-meter hurdles, gold medal Paris Olympics, July 2024. Personal best, 47.36 seconds, American record. The photograph on the website was unmistakably the same young man sitting quietly in seat 18A, enduring Victoria Brennan's harassment with extraordinary grace. "Oh my God," Laura whispered. "Michael, look at this." Michael leaned over to see the screen and his eyes widened. "That's him. That's actually him." "He's not just an Olympic athlete," Laura said quietly. "He's the Olympic champion. He set an American record. He's probably one of the most famous athletes in the country right now." They both looked across the cabin at Jordan, who was still sitting calmly in his window seat despite having been publicly accused of being a security threat. The black case in his lap wasn't carrying contraband or weapons. It was carrying one of the most coveted prizes in all of sports. "We have to do something," Michael said. "This woman is harassing an Olympic hero." Laura was already moving toward the cockpit. "I'm informing the captain immediately." This situation just became a lot more serious. Captain Murphy was reviewing flight plans when Laura appeared in the cockpit doorway with her tablet. "Captain, we have a situation with the passenger disturbance in economy. The woman who won't stay seated." "Yes, sir, but there's more. The young man she's been harassing, he's not just any passenger. He's Jordan Rivera, the Olympic gold medalist. He won the 400-meter hurdles in Paris 3 days ago." Captain Murphy set down his charts and looked at Laura's tablet screen. The official USA Track and Field website showed Jordan's photograph alongside his gold medal performance statistics. There was no question it was the same person sitting in 18A. "You're telling me that woman has been publicly harassing an Olympic champion for over an hour, sir? She's been accusing him of being a security threat, demanding to inspect his medal, and trying to turn other passengers against him." Captain Murphy's expression darkened. In his 20 years of flying, he'd developed a zero-tolerance policy for passenger discrimination, but this situation had just escalated to a level that required immediate action. "This is a PR nightmare waiting to happen," he said grimly. "If word gets out that we allowed an Olympic hero to be harassed on our aircraft..." "Sir, it may already be too late for that. Several passengers have been recording the confrontation. I've seen phones out throughout the cabin." Captain Murphy stood up and straightened his uniform. "I'm going back there personally. This ends now." While Laura was briefing the captain, Carlos Martinez was having the revelation of his social media career. His live stream had been gaining viewers steadily as the confrontation continued, and some of his more dedicated followers had been doing their own research in the comments section. "Holy shit," he whispered into his phone, forgetting for a moment that he was broadcasting live to nearly 200,000 viewers. "Y'all, someone in the comments just sent me a link. This kid isn't just any Olympic athlete. He's Jordan Rivera. He won the 400-meter hurdles. He set an American record. He's like literally one of the most famous athletes in the world right now." Carlos quickly pulled up the USA Track and Field website on his phone, comparing the official photos to the young man sitting just 3 rows behind him. The resemblance was unmistakable. "Oh my God, oh my God," he continued, his voice rising with excitement. "This woman has been harassing an Olympic gold medalist for an hour. This is insane. This is the craziest thing I've ever witnessed. If this blows your mind like it's blowing mine, smash that like button and share this with everyone you know," Carlos told his followers. This is about to be the biggest story on the internet. The revelation spread through the cabin like wildfire. Other passengers who had been following Carlos's live stream began pulling up their own phones to verify the information. Within minutes, multiple people were staring at their screens, then at Jordan, then back at their screens. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher who had been defending Jordan from the beginning, felt a surge of vindication mixed with horror. She'd known Victoria's behavior was wrong, but learning that she'd been attacking an Olympic champion made it even more outrageous. That poor boy, she murmured to the passenger next to her. He won a gold medal 3 days ago, and now he's being treated like a criminal for trying to get home. Jessica Liu, the medical student, was frantically scrolling through news articles about the Olympics on her phone. Jordan Rivera's victory had been front-page news just days earlier. The photo of him crossing the finish line, arms raised in triumph, had been shared millions of times across social media. "This is unbelievable," she said to Ryan Thompson, who was leaning over to see her screen. "He's not just any Olympic athlete. He's the guy who broke the American record. He's been all over the news." Ryan Thompson felt sick to his stomach. He'd initially felt some sympathy for Victoria's frustration about being downgraded from business class, but learning that she'd been harassing one of America's newest Olympic heroes made him ashamed of his earlier hesitation to fully defend Jordan. "We have to do something," he said to Jessica. "This woman has been attacking a national hero. What can we do? The crew is handling it. We can make sure everyone knows the truth." Ryan stood up and addressed the passengers around him in a voice loud enough for Victoria to hear. "Excuse me, everyone. I think you should know that the young man this woman has been harassing is Jordan Rivera. He won the Olympic gold medal in the 400-meter hurdles 3 days ago in Paris. He set an American record." A ripple of shock went through the cabin. Passengers who had been trying to ignore the confrontation suddenly sat up straighter. People began pulling out their phones to verify the information. The few passengers who had been neutral or supportive of Victoria's concerns suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of history. Victoria, who had been typing furiously on her phone and muttering about discrimination lawsuits, looked up sharply. "What did you say I said the young man you've been harassing is an Olympic gold medalist?" Ryan repeated, his voice carrying a new edge of anger. "Jordan Rivera. He's been all over the news for the past 3 days." Victoria's face went white. "That's impossible. Check for yourself," Jessica Liu called out, holding up her phone with Jordan's official Olympic profile displayed. "Jordan Rivera, 17 years old. Los Angeles. Gold medal 400-meter hurdles, new American record." Other passengers were now actively searching for information on their phones. Within moments, multiple screens were displaying photos of Jordan crossing the finish line in Paris, standing on the podium waving to crowds of cheering fans. "Oh my God," someone called out from several rows back. "It's really him. That's the kid who won gold in the hurdles." "I watched that race live," another passenger added. "He was incredible. Came from behind in the final 50 meters. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, staring at the screens being held up around her. The photos were unmistakable. The quiet, polite young man she'd been attacking for over an hour was indeed the Olympic champion who had been celebrated around the world just 3 days earlier. "No," she said weakly. "This can't be right." But the evidence was overwhelming. Passengers were now finding video clips of Jordan's victory photos of him with his medal interviews he'd given to sports reporters. The young man in seat 18A was not just an Olympic athlete, he was one of the newest American heroes. Captain Murphy emerged from the cockpit with the bearing of a military officer who had reached the end of his patience. At 51, he commanded instant respect when he entered a room, and the economy cabin fell silent as he walked down the aisle toward row 18. He stopped directly in front of Victoria, who was still clutching her phone with shaking hands, staring at the Olympic photos other passengers were showing her. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that brooked no argument, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. The passenger you have been harassing is Jordan Rivera, Olympic gold medalist and current American record holder in the 400-meter hurdles. His documentation is not only legitimate, it represents credentials earned through extraordinary achievement in representing our country at the highest level of international competition." The captain's words carried the weight of absolute authority, and they echoed through the cabin with devastating clarity. Every passenger within hearing distance turned to stare at Victoria, whose face had gone from white to a sickly gray color. "I want to personally apologize to Mr. Rivera for the treatment he has received on this aircraft." Captain Murphy continued, turning to address Jordan directly. "Sir, it is an honor to have you aboard, and I deeply regret that your travel experience has been marred by this incident." Jordan looked up at the captain with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Mr. Rivera, would you be willing to accept an upgrade to first class for the remainder of the flight? It's the least we can do after what you've been through." "That's very kind of you, sir. But I'm fine here. I just want to get home to see my family." The grace of Jordan's response sent another ripple through the cabin. Here was a young man who had been publicly humiliated and accused of being a threat, and his primary concern was still getting home to his family. The contrast with Victoria's behavior was becoming more stark by the moment. Captain Murphy nodded respectfully. "I understand, sir. Please let us know if there's anything at all we can do for you." He turned back to Victoria, and his expression hardened. "Ma'am, your behavior on this flight has been completely unacceptable. You have harassed and intimidated a passenger based on prejudicial assumptions, disrupted the flight experience for everyone aboard, and created a safety hazard with your refusal to remain seated." Victoria tried to speak, but the captain held up a hand to stop her. "I want you to understand the gravity of this situation," he continued. "You have publicly attacked an American Olympic hero. Your behavior has been recorded by multiple passengers and broadcast live on social media. This incident will be reported to Premier Airlines Corporate Headquarters, the Federal Aviation Administration, and potentially to law enforcement upon landing." The captain's words hit Victoria like physical blows. She was beginning to understand that her actions over the past hour hadn't just been embarrassing. They had been career-ending. "I want to make an announcement to all passengers," Captain Murphy said, reaching for the intercom handset. His voice came over the cabin speakers moments later, clear and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. It has come to my attention that we have a very special passenger aboard tonight. Mr. Jordan Rivera, who is traveling in seat 18A, won the Olympic gold medal in the 400-meter hurdles just 3 days ago in Paris, setting a new American record in the process. On behalf of Premier Airlines and all Americans aboard this flight, I want to congratulate Mr. Rivera on his extraordinary achievement and thank him for representing our country with such distinction." The cabin erupted. Passengers who hadn't been paying attention to the earlier confrontation suddenly realized they were flying with an Olympic champion. People began unbuckling their seatbelts to get a look at Jordan to take photos to offer congratulations. "Mr. Rivera," the captain's voice continued over the intercom, "if you're willing, the crew and I would be honored to present you with a small token of our appreciation for your service to American athletics." Jordan looked overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Carlos Martinez was frantically live-streaming the entire announcement, his viewer count now approaching 300,000, as word spread across social media that an Olympic champion was aboard the flight. What happened next would be remembered by everyone on Flight 847 for the rest of their lives. Led by Captain Murphy, the entire flight crew emerged from their stations and formed a line in the aisle next to row 18. Laura Vasquez, Michael Brooks, Amanda Foster, and the other attendants stood at attention while the captain addressed Jordan directly. "Mr. Rivera, it would be our honor if you would accept this small tribute to your achievement." The captain handed Jordan a Premier Airlines pin, typically reserved for elite frequent flyers, along with a handwritten note signed by the entire crew. But more importantly, the captain and crew rendered a crisp formal salute military precision that left no doubt about the respect they felt for Jordan's accomplishment. The cabin fell silent except for the clicking of phone cameras capturing the moment. Jordan looked genuinely moved by the gesture, his 17-year-old composure finally cracking slightly as he realized he was being honored by people who had witnessed his harassment but chosen to celebrate his achievement instead. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. This means a lot." The passengers erupted in applause. People were standing, taking photos, recording videos. Margaret Walsh was openly crying. Ryan Thompson was clapping so hard his hands hurt. Jessica Liu was streaming the salute live on her Instagram account. And Victoria Brennan sat in her middle seat, surrounded by the celebration of the young man she had spent an hour trying to destroy, realizing that her life as she knew it was over. Carlos Martinez was beside himself with excitement as his live stream broke 500,000 viewers. "Y'all, I cannot believe what just happened. This woman tried to get an Olympic champion kicked off the plane, and now the entire crew is saluting him. This is the most incredible thing I have ever witnessed." The comments section on every social media platform was exploding. Flight shame was trending worldwide. Video clips of Victoria's confrontation with Jordan were being shared millions of times, along with the revelation that she had been harassing an Olympic hero. But the most powerful image was the photograph that Margaret Walsh took of the crew saluting Jordan, while Victoria sat in the background, her face a mask of horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. That photo would be seen by tens of millions of people within hours. It would become the defining image of the consequences of prejudice, the power of grace under pressure, and the moment when Victoria Brennan's career died at 37,000 feet. The revelation was complete. The truth was out, and the consequences were about to begin. The celebration of Jordan Rivera's Olympic achievement had transformed the atmosphere in the cabin from one of tension and conflict to something approaching a party at cruising altitude. Passengers who had been strangers an hour earlier were now bonding over their shared experience of witnessing discrimination, confronted by grace, prejudice, defeated by truth. Margaret Walsh made her way to row 18, moving carefully down the aisle with the determination of someone who had something important to say. When she reached Jordan's seat, she leaned down and spoke in a voice loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "Young man, I want you to know that I've been teaching children for 40 years, and I have never seen anyone handle a difficult situation with more class and dignity than you just did. Your parents raised you right." Jordan looked up at her with genuine warmth. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot. What you did today matters," Margaret continued. "You showed everyone on this plane what real strength looks like. You didn't let her make you angry. You didn't sink to her level. You took the high road, and because of that, you won." Other passengers were now approaching Jordan's row, wanting to congratulate him, take photos, and share in the reflected glory of being on the same flight as an Olympic champion. Jordan handled each interaction with the same quiet grace he'd shown throughout the confrontation, signing autographs on napkins, posing for selfies, and answering questions about his training and his experience in Paris. Carlos Martinez finally worked up the courage to approach Jordan directly, his phone still live streaming to an audience that had now exceeded 600,000 viewers. "Hey man, I'm Carlos. I've been streaming this whole situation. I hope that's okay. I wanted people to see how wrong that woman was treating you." Jordan nodded. "It's okay. I appreciate you standing up for me. Dude, you're like the most famous athlete in America right now, and you were just sitting there taking abuse from someone who didn't even know who you were." "That's incredible." "I'm just trying to get home to my mom," Jordan replied with a slight smile. "She's been working double shifts so I could train for the Olympics. I can't wait to see her." The simple honesty of his response, the fact that his primary concern was still seeing his mother despite everything that had happened, sent another wave of admiration through the watching passengers. Here was an Olympic champion who remained grounded in what really mattered: family. Meanwhile, Victoria Brennan sat in her middle seat like a ghost at the feast, watching the celebration of the young man she had tried to destroy. Her phone was buzzing constantly with notifications, but she was afraid to look at them. She could see other passengers staring at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. Jessica Liu, the medical student, felt compelled to document what she had witnessed for her psychology coursework. The confrontation had been a perfect case study in implicit bias discrimination and the way prejudice could blind people to obvious truths. "This is going in my thesis," she told Ryan Thompson. "The way that woman was so convinced she was right even when all the evidence contradicted her assumptions. It's textbook confirmation bias combined with racial prejudice." Ryan was still processing his own role in the situation. "I feel terrible that I didn't speak up sooner. When she first started harassing him, I should have said something immediately." "You spoke up when it mattered," Jessica reassured him. "A lot of people would have just kept quiet the whole time." Laura Vasquez was already on the phone with Premier Airlines corporate headquarters, briefing them on the situation that was rapidly becoming a public relations crisis of unprecedented proportions. The social media posts were multiplying exponentially, and the hashtag flight shame was now trending in multiple countries. "Sir, we have a passenger who spent over an hour harassing our Olympic gold medalist passenger," she was explaining to the senior VP of Customer Relations. The entire confrontation was live-streamed and recorded by multiple passengers. "We're looking at a potential PR disaster of enormous magnitude." The corporate response was swift and decisive. Within 30 minutes of Laura's call, a team of executives was assembled to monitor the social media fallout and develop a crisis management strategy. Premier Airlines' stock price had already begun to fluctuate as news of the incident spread, but the most significant consequences were happening in real time for Victoria Brennan herself. Victoria's phone finally stopped buzzing long enough for her to check her messages, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Dozens of missed calls from her assistant, her colleagues, and most ominously from Richard Harrison, the CEO of Meridian Financial. The most recent text message was from her assistant Victoria: "You need to call the office immediately. The Henderson meeting has been cancelled. Emergency board meeting called for 8 a.m. London time. London. Social media is exploding. This is bad." Victoria's hands shook as she opened her Twitter app and searched for her own name. What she found was devastating. Video clips of her confronting Jordan were being shared thousands of times per minute. The hashtag Victoria Brennan was trending alongside flight shame, and the comments were universally brutal. "Racist business exec harasses Olympic hero on plane. This is why diversity matters in corporate leadership. Victoria Brennan from Meridian Financial should be fired immediately. How can someone this prejudiced be trusted with major business decisions?" The videos showed her at her worst, demanding to inspect Jordan's case, accusing him of being a security threat, trying to turn other passengers against him. But they also showed his remarkable grace under pressure, his polite responses, his quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation. The contrast was damning. Victoria frantically dialed Richard Harrison's direct line, praying he would answer despite the late hour in London. "Victoria." His voice was ice cold when he picked up on the first ring. "I assume you're calling about the videos." "Richard, I can explain. There was a misunderstanding. I was concerned about security." "Victoria, stop. I've watched the videos. We all have. The Henderson board has seen them. The media has seen them. You harassed an Olympic champion for an hour based on nothing but prejudice, and it was all recorded." "It wasn't prejudice," Victoria protested desperately. "I had legitimate concerns about an unidentified case." "Victoria, the young man was carrying his Olympic gold medal. The medal he won representing our country 3 days ago. And you treated him like a terrorist because of how he looked." The silence stretched between them across the Atlantic, heavy with the weight of a 26-year career ending in real time. "The Henderson deal is dead," Harrison continued. "They called an hour ago, said they cannot do business with a company that employs someone capable of such behavior. The board has already voted. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Richard, please, I've given 26 years to this company. One mistake. One mistake. Victoria, you publicly humiliated an American hero on a plane full of people recording everything. Do you understand what this does to our reputation, to our relationships with clients, to our diversity initiatives?" Victoria felt her world collapsing around her. The $2 million bonus, the promotion she'd been working toward, the executive VP position that had been within her grasp, all of it evaporating like smoke. "Your corporate credit cards have been canceled," Harrison continued mercilessly. "Your access to company resources has been revoked. HR will be in touch about the return of company property. Goodbye, Victoria." The line went dead. Victoria stared at her phone in shock, then quickly opened her banking app. Her corporate credit card showed as account closed. Her company expense account was frozen. She was stranded in London with her personal credit cards and whatever cash she had in her wallet. But the financial consequences were just the beginning. Her LinkedIn profile was being flooded with negative comments. Her professional network was distancing themselves from her at light speed. Recruitment firms that had been courting her for years were suddenly unreachable. The videos from the plane were being shared not just by random social media users, but by journalists, politicians, and celebrities who were using her behavior as an example of everything wrong with corporate culture and implicit bias in America. Within 6 hours of the confrontation, Victoria Brennan had become the most infamous business executive in the world. The Flight 847 incident, as it came to be known in corporate training materials, triggered a wave of policy changes across the airline industry that went far beyond Premier Airlines' immediate response. Captain Murphy filed a detailed incident report that was shared with the Federal Aviation Administration industry trade groups and Premier's corporate headquarters. The report documented not just the immediate confrontation, but the broader pattern of passenger discrimination that flight crews witnessed on a regular basis. This incident represents a failure of current protocols for handling discrimination complaints, Murphy wrote in his report. "We need comprehensive training programs that help crew members recognize and respond to bias-based conflicts before they escalate to the level witnessed on Flight 847. Premier Airlines' response was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 weeks of the incident, the airline announced the Dignity in Flight initiative, a complete overhaul of crew training protocols, passenger complaint procedures, and conflict resolution strategies. The new program included mandatory bias awareness training for all crew members, updated procedures for documenting and reporting discrimination incidents, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment based on race, religion, appearance, or perceived status. But the changes went deeper than training programs. Premier partnered with the Olympic Committee to create a special recognition program for elite athletes traveling on their flights. They also established a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth athletes, funded in part by donations from passengers who had been inspired by Jordan's story. Other airlines quickly followed suit. Within 6 months, the International Air Transport Association had developed industry-wide guidelines for preventing and addressing passenger discrimination. The Flight 847 incident became required viewing in airline training programs around the world. The broader business community took notice as well. Harvard Business School added a case study about Victoria Brennan's downfall to their curriculum on corporate ethics and crisis management. The case became a cautionary tale about the career consequences of allowing personal bias to influence professional behavior. Meridian Financial, desperate to repair its reputation after the Henderson deal collapsed, hired a new chief diversity officer and implemented sweeping changes to their hiring and promotion practices. But the damage had been done. The company's stock price fell 15% in the week following the incident, and they lost 3 major clients who cited concerns about corporate culture in their departure letters. For Jordan Rivera, the confrontation on Flight 847 became an unexpected platform for advocacy work that extended far beyond his athletic achievements. The grace he had shown under pressure resonated with people around the world, and he used his newfound celebrity to speak out about discrimination and the importance of treating all people with dignity. His foundation, established with endorsement money from sponsors who were inspired by his character, focused on providing equipment and training opportunities for underprivileged youth athletes. But it also funded scholarships for students studying conflict resolution and cultural sensitivity. "What happened on that plane was wrong," Jordan said in his first television interview after the incident. "But what mattered more was how we responded to it. We can't control how other people treat us, but we can control how we treat them in return." The interview was viewed by over 10 million people and spawned countless articles about the power of grace under pressure. Jordan became a sought-after speaker at corporate events, diversity conferences, and youth programs. For Victoria Brennan, the consequences were devastating and permanent. Unable to find employment in the financial industry, she eventually moved to a small town outside Manchester, where she took a job as a bookkeeper for a local accounting firm. Her salary was a fraction of what she had earned at Meridian, and her career prospects were permanently damaged. She changed her name legally and avoided social media entirely, but the videos from Flight 847 continued to follow her. Potential employers would discover her identity during background checks, and job offers would mysteriously disappear. The irony was not lost on anyone who followed her story. Victoria had spent her entire career climbing the corporate ladder, fighting against the discrimination she had faced as a working-class woman in a male-dominated industry. But in one moment of prejudice against Jordan Rivera, she had destroyed everything she had worked to build. The lesson was clear. Prejudice is a luxury that no one can afford, especially in an age when every moment can be recorded and shared with the world. Character matters more than credentials, and grace under pressure is worth more than gold. Or in Jordan's case, it was worth more than Olympic gold. 8 hours after takeoff, Premier Airlines Flight 847 began its descent into London Heathrow Airport as the first rays of dawn painted the English countryside in shades of gold and amber. The cabin was quiet now, most passengers dozing or reading, but the events of the night had left an indelible mark on everyone aboard. Jordan Rivera sat in his window seat watching the familiar patchwork of fields and highways grow larger as they approached landing. The black case containing his Olympic gold medal rested securely in his lap, just as it had for the entire flight. But everything else had changed. His phone was buzzing with messages from his agent, his coach, his mother, and reporters who had somehow gotten his number. The incident had gone far beyond viral. It had become a global news story. Videos of the confrontation and the crew's salute had been viewed tens of millions of times across every social media platform. But Jordan wasn't thinking about fame or media attention. He was thinking about his mother Elena, who would be waiting for him at Heathrow after working the night shift at Newark University Hospital. She had no idea what had happened on the flight, and he was dreading having to explain why there would likely be cameras waiting when they landed. 3 rows forward. Victoria Brennan stared out the window at the approaching runway with the hollow eyes of someone whose life had just ended. Her phone had stopped buzzing an hour ago, not because the world had lost interest, but because everyone who mattered in her professional life had already cut ties with her. The corporate credit cards were canceled. The job was gone. The London meeting that was supposed to define her career had been replaced by corporate lawyers trying to minimize damage control. In 8 hours, she had fallen from the heights of executive success to being unemployable in her chosen field. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Captain Murphy's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow Airport. Local time is 6:42 a.m. Before you deplane, I want to thank Mr. Jordan Rivera once more for his extraordinary grace during tonight's flight. His response to an unfortunate situation reminded all of us what true character looks like. The cabin erupted in one final round of applause for Jordan, who acknowledged it with a modest wave before gathering his belongings. As the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began standing to collect their carry-on bags, a remarkable thing happened. One by one, passengers approached Jordan's row to shake his hand, offer congratulations, or simply say thank you. Margaret Walsh hugged him like a grandmother saying goodbye to a beloved grandson. Carlos Martinez gave him his contact information and promised to send him copies of the most positive moments from the live stream. Jessica Liu asked if she could interview him for her thesis on conflict resolution. "You handled that better than most adults would have," Ryan Thompson told him. "Your parents should be proud." "I hope I never forget what real dignity looks like," said a businessman who had watched the entire confrontation in stunned silence. Victoria remained seated as the parade of well-wishers filed past each handshake and congratulation, serving as a reminder of the grace she had been offered and rejected. Jordan had given her multiple opportunities to de-escalate the situation, to apologize, to simply treat him with basic human respect. Instead, she had chosen to double down on her prejudice at every turn. When the aisle finally cleared and it was time to deplane, Victoria found herself walking directly behind Jordan as they moved toward the exit. The irony was crushing. She was literally following in the footsteps of the young man she had tried to destroy. At the aircraft door, Laura Vasquez was saying goodbye to passengers with the professional warmth that had made her one of Premier's most respected flight attendants. When Jordan reached the door, she stopped him. "Mr. Rivera, it was truly an honor flying with you tonight. I'm sorry for what you experienced, but I'm grateful for the way you handled it. You taught all of us something important." "Thank you, Laura. You and your crew were incredible." Victoria reached the door next, and Laura's expression noticeably cooled. "Ma'am" was all she said, with none of the warmth she had shown other passengers. The contrast was subtle, but unmistakable. Even in her professional capacity, Laura could not bring herself to pretend that Victoria's behavior had been acceptable. As they entered the jet bridge, Victoria could see news cameras at the far end waiting in the terminal. Reporters had gotten word of the viral incident and were hoping to catch interviews with the key players. She pulled her scarf up around her face and put on sunglasses, desperate to avoid being recognized. Jordan, meanwhile, walked toward the cameras with the same quiet confidence he had maintained throughout the flight. He had already decided he would answer questions honestly, but without malice, just as he had responded to Victoria's attacks. London's financial district hummed with its usual energy on a crisp December morning, but for Victoria Brennan, now going by the name Ann Patterson, the city felt like a foreign country. She sat in a tiny office above a curry restaurant in East London, working as a contract bookkeeper for small businesses that paid her a fraction of what she had once earned per hour at Meridian Financial. Her life had become a study in downward mobility. The expensive suits had been sold or donated, replaced by second-hand sweaters that never quite fit properly. The Manhattan penthouse was gone, replaced by a small flat in a neighborhood where she knew no one and no one knew her history. The Porsche had been traded for a monthly bus pass, but the isolation was worse than the financial hardship. Victoria had discovered that shame was a powerful form of solitary confinement. She avoided social media, didn't own a television, and had cut herself off from all news sources to avoid seeing references to the incident that had destroyed her life. Every few weeks, someone would recognize her from the viral videos. Sometimes they would stare. Sometimes they would take pictures. Once a young black woman had approached her in a coffee shop and said simply, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Victoria had left immediately, her coffee untouched. The worst part was the dreams. Nearly every night she relived the confrontation on Flight 847, but in her dreams she made different choices. She apologized to Jordan. She sat quietly in her seat. She treated him with the respect he deserved. But she always woke up to the reality that those choices could never be unmade. Meanwhile, Jordan Rivera was becoming one of the most recognizable athletes in America. His performance on Flight 847 had earned him endorsement deals worth millions, but more importantly, it had given him a platform to speak about issues that mattered to him. The Rivera Foundation had grown into a major force in youth athletics, providing equipment coaching and scholarships to young athletes from underserved communities. But Jordan had also become an advocate for conflict resolution and restorative justice, using his story to teach people about the power of grace under pressure. On a Tuesday evening in December, exactly 6 months after Flight 847, Jordan was flying from Los Angeles to London for a charity event when fate intervened once more. Due to a last-minute cancellation, a passenger in economy had been upgraded to business class, leaving an empty seat in the back of the plane. The passenger who took that empty seat was a woman in her 50s, wearing a worn winter coat and carrying a single battered carry-on bag. She kept her head down as she boarded, hoping not to be recognized, and found her way to seat 38E, a middle seat near the lavatories. Ann Patterson, the woman who had once been Victoria Brennan, settled into the uncomfortable seat and tried to make herself invisible. She had no idea that 3 rows ahead of her, in seat 2A, sat Jordan Rivera. Jordan had been upgraded to first class, automatically a courtesy that Premier Airlines now extended to him on every flight. He was reading a book about conflict resolution when he noticed a commotion in the boarding area. A woman had stumbled slightly, getting out of the way of another passenger, and something about her movement caught his attention. Their eyes met across the cabin for just a moment, and Jordan felt his breath catch. Even with the changed hair color and the worn clothes, he recognized her immediately. Victoria Brennan, the woman who had tried to destroy him 6 months earlier, now looking like a shadow of her former self. For a brief moment, the universe seemed to pause. Jordan in his spacious first-class seat, successful and beloved. Victoria in economy, anonymous and alone. The reversal of fortune was complete, but as Jordan looked at her, he felt no satisfaction, no sense of vindication. Instead, he felt something unexpected pity. He watched as she quickly looked away and buried her face in a magazine, clearly hoping to avoid recognition. He saw the way her hands trembled slightly as she opened the pages. He noticed the cheap clothes, the absence of jewelry, the entire diminished presence of someone whose life had been fundamentally altered. Jordan closed his book and made a decision that would have surprised everyone who knew the story of Flight 847. He quietly asked the flight attendant if he could move to an empty seat in economy. "Sir, you don't want to give up your first-class seat," the attendant protested. "Yes, I do," Jordan said simply. He gathered his belongings and walked to the back of the plane, stopping at Victoria's row. She looked up when his shadow fell across her seat, and her eyes filled with what looked like terror. "Ma'am," Jordan said quietly, so only she could hear, "I just wanted you to know that I forgive you. What happened that night wasn't okay, but holding on to anger doesn't help anyone. I hope you find peace." He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded respectfully and walked back to his upgraded seat, leaving Victoria staring after him with tears streaming down her face. By the time Flight 847 to Paris had become a memory, its impact had rippled far beyond the passengers who witnessed it firsthand. The incident had been studied in business schools, discussed in corporate boardrooms, and referenced in diversity training programs around the world. But the real legacy wasn't in the policy changes or the academic discussions. It was in the lesson that a 17-year-old Olympic champion had taught an entire plane about the power of grace under pressure. Jordan Rivera had faced prejudice with dignity, responded to hatred with respect, and met ignorance with education. He had shown that true strength isn't about fighting back, it's about rising above. He had proven that character matters more than credentials, and that how we treat others in difficult moments defines who we truly are. The story of Flight 847 became a reminder that in an age when every moment can be recorded and shared with the world, Our actions have consequences that extend far beyond what we might imagine. But it also showed that grace is powerful, forgiveness is possible, and redemption sometimes comes in the form of a quiet word of peace spoken across an airplane aisle. Jordan never spoke publicly about his encounter with Victoria on that December flight. He simply continued to live by the principles his mother had taught him. Treat others with respect, stand up for what's right, and remember that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about. As he often said in interviews, champions aren't made in stadiums. They're made in moments when no one's watching, when it would be easier to respond with anger than with grace. The real victory isn't crossing the finish line first. It's helping others find their way to the starting line. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stand up when you see discrimination. Be the voice for those who need it. Because sometimes the person you defend today might change the world tomorrow. And sometimes the grace you show to someone who has wronged you might be the moment that saves them from themselves. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of dignity over discrimination. Subscribe for more stories that prove character conquers conflict and love ultimately wins over hate. Share this video with 3 people who need to be reminded that we all have the choice to respond with grace, even when it's hard. Because in a world that often seems divided, we need more reminders of what unites us all: our shared humanity, and our capacity to choose kindness even when others choose cruelty. Comment below about a time when you witnessed someone stand up for what's right. Let's build a community of people committed to treating everyone with dignity and respect. Ring that notification bell so you never miss stories that inspire us to be better than we were yesterday. Together, we can create a world where everyone feels safe to simply exist without judgment, where character matters more than appearance, and where grace always defeats hate.